Welcome everyone. This is Vikas from NovelVista. Thanks for joining this webinar session on ITSM in digital age, where we are going to see how SRE and ITIL4 align with DevOps, and this is through NovelVista and DOI. So we have Jane, who's our speaker today. She is a co-founder and CEO of DevOps Institute with an experience of more than 25 years in different roles across a wide range of industry. Jane is very active in the ITSM, Agile, and DevOps communities, and is also an author in Agile Management Guide. So let me take a couple of minutes to also introduce NovelVista before I hand it over to Jane. NovelVista is an 8-year-old company, and we are into trainings and certifications, as most of you already know. We have trained more than 30,000 participants across various practices, processes, and technologies, with a huge portfolio of more than 2,000 courses and a team of more than 300 trainers who are associated with us. So being one of the largest training organizations in such a short span of time, we have always strongly believed in knowledge sharing. One of such knowledge sharing initiatives is webinars. So we are we are introducing our participants to industry practices or different experts like Jane. They talk about different practices, processes, new technologies, and we keep on doing these webinars. So in case you want to register for any further webinars, you can always call us back or you can contact us. So topic for today's session, as I said, is ITSM in digital age, how SRE and ITIL4 align with DevOps. So now I hand it over to Jane. Jane, you can take it from here.
Good, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Jane Grohl, CEO of the DevOps Institute, and I'm delighted today to spend some time with the NovelVista community, really looking at service management in the new decade. I mean, for some of us, it's just hard to believe that we're in the year 2020 and looking at the acceleration of technology and how fast everything is moving over the course of my career, and I'm sure over the course of yours, no matter how long that's been. So today we're going to spend some time really looking at DevOps, which, you know, for many of you might recognize that DevOps has become an initiative for many enterprises across the world. DevOps Institute, our global community is very widespread, and I would tell you that DevOps is a top of mind initiative for many large enterprises that previously might not have been in this type of disruptive state. So we're going to look at DevOps, but we're also going to look at it in relationship to IT service management. You know, as you might have seen from my bio, I have a long heritage in the ITSM space. I was involved in ITIL4, ITIL3, and then transitioned over to DevOps and now with site reliability engineering, really kind of seeing a little bit of a new age of ITSM as well. But, you know, to get us all started, I'm just going to run a little poll just to find out what your experience is with some of these practices. So if you would, just take a couple of minutes and share with me, how experienced or familiar are you with DevOps? That'll help me shape today's presentation. Okay, a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll, and we'll take a look at the results. Oops, looks like my calendar popped up. Okay, so how familiar are you or experienced with you in DevOps? So about 10% of you said very, you know, about 64%, the majority said somewhat. About 26%, I've heard the term, but I'm really not sure what it is. And again, not surprising, none of you said that you've never heard of it before. So obviously that is something that, you know, we want to make sure that you're really comfortable with. Okay, I'm going to ask one more poll, and then we'll get going with the presentation. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about site reliability engineering because it is a new topic. It's rising very, very quickly. So let me launch that poll and see how familiar you are with site reliability engineering. Okay, and again, just a few more seconds. Let me close that poll. Share the results. Okay, so this is even more interesting, right? So about 13% of you said, well, yeah, I'm familiar or experienced with SRE. About 16% said, somewhat. 34% have said, I've heard the term, I'm not sure what it is. And then really interestingly, 37% said you've never heard of it before. So it is my great honor and privilege to introduce you to it today, and perhaps NovelVista and DevOps Institute can plan a little bit more of a what is SRE webinar in the future. Good. Okay, so that gives me an opportunity to really kind of shape today's presentation according to your level of experience. So as I said, we're going to really look at managing services in the new decade. But just to start, if you're not familiar with DevOps Institute, we advance the human elements of DevOps. As DevOps has evolved, certainly there is a lot of focus on automation and the need to be able to automate a lot of the processes, particularly for the build, test, and deploy aspects of continuous integration, continuous delivery. But make no mistake about it, it's going to be the humans that are going to drive transformation. And so at DevOps Institute, our mission is to advance the human elements of DevOps by equipping you with what we think is the holistic needs of the human of DevOps: skills, knowledge, ideas, and learning. And we do that by accrediting and orchestrating SKIL with certifications, with research, with ongoing learning opportunities, with events, and certainly our goal is to be able to connect the community. And we're really delighted to work with partners like NovelVista because they are the ones that bring SKIL to you, right, in a local presence, in a training environment. So we do operate through a network of global education partners. And again, very, very proud to have NovelVista as one of ours as well. And if you're not already a member of DevOps Institute, go up to our website, www.devopsinstitute.com, become a member. Today it's free. There's a lot of really amazing assets out there, some good reports, some good blogs, and some good content. So again, a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. In order to manage services in a modern environment, we have to be good systems thinkers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about systems thinking and what that actually means and how that affects service management. If we're going to look at DevOps and how ITIL4 and SRE relate to DevOps, then we need to understand the core principles associated with DevOps, and that's really reflected in what's known as the 3 ways from the book, The Phoenix Project. So I'll explain a little bit about that as well. Then we're going to take a look at ITIL4, really map it against the 3 ways so that we can see how ITIL4 supports the principles of DevOps. And then we're going to look a little bit deeper at site reliability engineering, SRE, and similarly how it reflects against the principles of DevOps. And I'm spending a little bit of extra time on SRE because I suspected that many of you may not have a lot of familiarity with site reliability engineering, particularly as it relates to IT service management. Talk a little bit about change management. ITSM, the Crossroads of DevOps and ITSM, is really at change management. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but just to kind of look at the differences in the models so that when you're working with your organization, you can kind of understand where change management is. And then I'll give you a few tips for getting started. So let's talk about systems thinking. So if you really think about IT, and if you've been in IT more than a few years, you know, this slide probably reflects the cadence or the flow of your organization. So if you think of IT as a system of systems, there really are three very, very distinct systems that sit within IT. The first is development, right? So organizations have really actively moved away from waterfall development, which was very linear, right? Everything happened in sequence, to more of an agile approach where smaller increments of code were developed, but more frequently, right? So that was kind of the seed of what we would call DevOps, where you go smaller, but you go more frequently. And the development cycle really looks at breaking down big code into small code. Right. But agile, whether it's Scrum or SAFe or any of the agile software development methods, is a distinct system, meaning it has its own vocabulary, it has its own ways of working, it has its own tools. And so it's almost like a system that's different from the other systems in IT. But that really was the start, where organizations started to move their development away from this very linear approach to this very cycle approach that really has become the norm in agile software development. But again, remember, a system is defined by a different way of working, a different set of vocabularies, and a different set of tools. Well, the code that came out of the agile software development teams had to go downstream before it was released into production. And so that launched another system. You might have called it service design and service transition if you were an ITIL organization. You might have called it QA or security, depending on how your organization was formed, right? Over the past few years, it's really kind of evolved into continuous integration and continuous delivery, launching then continuous deployment, continuous testing, right, where everything is continuous. But really, the system that happens with the code is really the build, test, deploy system, right? Regardless of what you call it or how it was executed. But it was a separate and distinct system. So even if we look at CI/CD as a separate system, it does have its own vocabulary. It does have its own ways of working. It does have its own automation in the form of continuous delivery pipelines. And so it became another system, right? And so that system has had to evolve very quickly, whereas a lot of the work might have been manual before. Now suddenly there's a lot of automation that's being introduced. But truthfully, it doesn't matter, because the first system of agile software development doesn't really understand what this system of continuous delivery is all about, right? They don't speak the language, they don't have the same ways of working, they don't have the same tools. So that became system number two. And then when the code is deployed, whether it's deployed through continuous delivery and somebody presses the button, or it goes automatically into production with continuous deployment, another system is launched, and that's operations, right? So that's post-production operations. You might have called it service operation, you might have called it service support. Today, many are calling it site reliability engineering, but it is where value is created. It's where your consumers use your product, whether they're business consumers or enterprise consumers. It is where the product is delivered day after day, hour after hour. And so that launched a whole new system, right? New tools, new vocabulary, new ways of working. And so the problem with IT, truthfully, over the last several years, is that each of these systems has delivered some level of value, but they're not interoperable. Right? So we use the term interoperable when we talk about tools. The reality is the systems have to be interoperable too. And so we have to think of this as a single system, that instead of these three separate and distinct systems, because there's an inherent delay. Right. So if agile software development is passing things off to continuous delivery, there's an inherent delay because there's almost like a translation that's required there. And then when it gets deployed, there's an inherent delay because, again, the operations folks don't really know what happened in the previous systems. So the message here is we have to see the system as a whole. And we have to start not only aligning our processes, we really have to start making those processes, making those tools, making that vocabulary interoperable. Today, we're an organization of specialists, and I'll talk a little bit about the hybrid DevOps human, which is going to be the human of DevOps or the human of IT for the new decade. So let's face facts. We're moving away from project management. We've been migrating toward product management. You might be hearing a lot about product management, but at the end of the day, what you deliver to your customers, again, regardless of whoever your customer is you deliver service, right? And so we need to understand that that value is only ever created when the product delivers a service, right? Your mobile phone is a product. It doesn't deliver value to you until you can do something that's important to you with it, whether it's send a text, whether it's look at a video, whether it's actually making a phone call. And those services will always need to be managed, right? So while many of us equate ITIL with service management, the reality is that services need to be managed regardless of how you do that, right? You'll always need to manage changes. You'll always need to manage incidents. You'll always need to manage reliability in your infrastructure. So never forget that ITSM or service management, however you want to coin that, will always be important because we will always have to manage services. Right? The question is how. So as I said early on, what I want to do is kind of frame this around what's known as the 3 ways of DevOps. So if you've never read the Phoenix Project, I would highly encourage you to do that. It is a business novel. So first of all, you get to know some of the characters, which is always kind of fun. But second of all, you can really kind of reflect on how this organization relates to your organization, current, past, and maybe even future. But inside the Phoenix Project, Gene Kim and his co-authors really defined 3 ways. Now, by the way, the sequel, well, it isn't really a sequel. It's kind of happening at the same time. The Unicorn Project takes this even one step further. But for today, I'm not going to move into that direction. I really want to look at the 3 ways of DevOps because it does define the underlying principles around which DevOps is built, right? And at its heart, that's really what DevOps it is. And so we're going to look at the first way of flow, the second way of shortened feedback, and the third way of continuous learning. And we're going to kind of look at that with the lens of ITIL4 and with site reliability engineering, because those right now are the 2 most prominent ITSM or service management approaches. So again, I kind of want to just start off telling you a little bit about that. If you take the DevOps Foundation course with NovelVista, you'll learn a lot more about the 3 ways, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a high level. So in order for us to increase flow, which means we have to go faster, right? We have to go faster. We have to be able to look left to right. And so understanding how flow occurs, where the bottlenecks are, where the constraints are, is considered the first way. The first way is to increase the flow from left to right, right? From development all the way up to and beyond production. But in order to do that, the second way is to look at how do we shorten feedback loops, right? How do we provide ongoing feedback all along that value stream so that any corrections that need to be made can be made earlier instead of waiting immediately before the code goes into production? That would have been the way of waterfall. So the second way is creating these short feedback loops where the opportunity to get that kind of input, and it's not just testing, by the way, but to get that kind of input early on, frequently, so that course corrections can be made is certainly there. The third way is, to me, the most interesting, right? The third way is to be able to continuously learn through experimentation. So it's culture. It's creating a culture where we learn from failure. It's creating a culture, and many of you can understand this. You can't become a master if you don't practice, right? So it's creating a culture of ongoing learning, of ongoing experimentation, and ongoing practice so that we can become masters, right? We can recover faster from incidents. So again, increase your flow, shorten your feedback, become a culture of continuous learning. Those are the 3 ways of DevOps. So let's take a little look at ITIL4, and let me launch a poll just to see how familiar you are with ITIL4. So I'm launching that now. Okay, a couple more seconds. And I'm going to close it. So again, this is a little different than site reliability engineering, right? So about 24% of you said you're very familiar with ITIL4. Again, some of you may be familiar with ITIL3 or even going back to ITIL2. But 62% said somewhat. So again, I would sort of suspect that ITIL4, which is not in full release yet, right? It's been releasing a little bit at a time. 11% said, I've heard the term, but I'm not sure what it is. That's interesting. Nobody said you've never heard of it. And about 2% said not applicable, which again, I think is kind of interesting. So let's explore ITIL4 and DevOps from what we know today, to be fair, because I said the ITIL4 release has been very incremental. And so I think some of the books which will have more depth have not necessarily been released yet. So, you know, as I mentioned early on, I have a long heritage in ITIL in particular. I taught ITIL for about 15 years. I had the privilege of being one of the insiders for a very, very long time. And so we look at ITIL4 and we look at particularly this diagram. First of all, ITIL4 very much moves away from the idea of service lifecycle and now creates a service value system. So as you kind of pick up a theme between DevOps, between Agile, with Lean, value stream mapping, with site reliability engineering, and now with ITIL4, the focus is on value, right? A service is not a service unless it delivers value. ITIL4 does, at least from what we've seen so far, does retain much of the previous guidance with some updates. So there is a nod to ITIL3 and before in terms of some of the practices, some of the guidance, some of the activities that occur within those. What used to be a process is now known as a practice with some updates. So there are nods to continuous delivery. There are nods to some of the new concepts. There are nods to Agile, nods to DevOps, right? There is a very strong focus on governance, right? So it still is a system that has a fair amount of approval layers associated with it, a fair amount of command and control, but easing some of that away, right? Easing some of that away in the form of, say, more peer-to-peer review of change management, of changes, and things like that. It is a little bit bimodal, and what I mean by that is that it affirms what you're doing today, and then offers the opportunity to kind of do a DevOps-y type of approach as well as a strong governance approach from the past. The publications are matched to the certification. So each of the books that have been released so far are mapped to a certification. And again, I think there is homage, if you want to use that word. It honors Agile and DevOps, but I think that when we get deeper into the future publications, we'll see a lot more depth of guidance. So again, to be fair, we haven't seen it all yet. So we don't, we can't really make a decision in terms of how much of an alignment there actually is. But so far, there seems to be at least a reflection on a lot of the activities that have emerged in both Agile software development and DevOps. Interestingly enough, the guiding principles of ITIL4 really do align with a lot of what we've seen in DevOps. This actually came out of the ITIL practitioner book, and so they migrated it forward into ITIL4. And and as I said, focus on value, right? Really look at how does a service deliver value? Progress iteratively with feedback, right? So there's that shortened feedback loop. Think and work holistically. There's a little bit of systems thinking that's associated with it. Start where you are, right? So you don't have to start at the beginning, start where your pain areas are. And then if you kind of look at the others, collaborations, keeping it simple, being practical, optimize and automate. These are strong principles regardless of whatever framework you might be engaging. And so if we really look at how does this align with DevOps, you can see the first way, right? You could see collaborate and promote visibility, because that really does increase flow. And if we can visualize our value stream, I think there's quite a lot to be said about that. I lost my progressor. Looking at the second way, right? There's the second way of shorten your feedback loop. So progress iteratively with feedback, so that if you're going to move in increments, right, small and frequent, then being able to shorten those feedback loops makes quite a lot of sense. And then optimize and automate is really, again, a little bit of the third way, where we start to understand continuous learning and practicing in order to be a master. So if we really look at ITIL as, the service management framework that has been applied in many, many organizations over the last, let's say, 15 years, it is adopted by most enterprises. And I said the shift to a value system, I think, makes a lot of sense. To be honest and to be transparent, I really am waiting for more depth in the future publications, just to understand where the actual alignment is to DevOps and Agile, mostly because, to be fair, in the past, and again, to kind of give credence to ITIL was originally born when waterfall was the most common approach to software development. So it mapped to that, right? It was a very linear type of framework. Even inside the service lifecycle, every process kind of had a linear set of activities, and that will always be the case. The key here is, if you look, at the graphic, you do see the service lifecycle kind of embedded in this. So I said I'm pretty confident that the future publications will really look at speed, so that these processes are not necessarily going to be the same as they were before. The spirit will be there, the speed will be a little bit better. But again, there is a lot of focus. Now, it does have some new vocabulary, and so I think that the migration from one version to another, it's not like software upgrades, but I do think there is an adaptation of some of the previous learnings. But I think everything in ITIL3 still applies. There still is a lot of processes that are now considered practices, and many of those are the same, perhaps with a different perspective. But again, from an alignment with DevOps, the focus on value is good. The shortened feedback loops are good. Certainly the emphasis on continuous learning is strong as well. So it's my great privilege to introduce many of you to site reliability engineering. As we saw from the poll, some of you never even heard of it. So I'm kind of particularly excited to talk to you about site reliability engineering, because in my opinion, it is the most innovative approach to ITSM since ITIL. If you want to read the Site Reliability Engineering Workbook, which is how this was all born, it was created by a bunch of folks from Google. And it really reflected how Google keeps their very complex systems reliable, right? So it's very much about operational excellence, but it extends its arm back into development. So there is a lot of aspects of site reliability engineering that engages very, very early on in the cycle. You can read the book for free on the Google site. There is a couple of other books that are related to it. Site reliability engineering is the first book. There's a site reliability engineering workbook, and then there's Seeking SRE, which is a complementary book by another author. So again, if you're interested in learning more about these practices, you absolutely can read these books for free on the Google site. And they're not short, they're not ebooks, right? The site reliability engineering book's about 500 pages. So, I mean, it's got a pretty healthy set of practices and descriptive ways of working. Some say it's more technical than, say, ITIL. I would say that's true, but remember, we're all in IT. We should be at least a little bit technical. And I'm, kind of the least technical person probably today. So according to Ben Trainosloss from Google, it's a great quote. SRE is what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an operations function. So if you look at the core principles of SRE, you can see some of the alignment, certainly with DevOps. You certainly can see some of the alignments even with ITIL4, but again, taking it kind of down to its basics. You need to manage against service level objectives with consequences. So if you have any experience in ITIL, that's service level management, right? The ability to regulate your own workload. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute. SRE, unlike ITIL and other frameworks, you might have heard of Verism, SRE is a real job. Right, so there is a role called a site reliability engineer. It is the 5th fastest growing job according to LinkedIn. DevOps Institute does research on upskilling. It grew 6 points this year. So that is a key difference, that SRE is an actual role that companies are hiring. So SREs need the ability to regulate their own workload. That's very similar to agile software development, where the team gets to kind of figure out they know what they've been told they have to accomplish. It's up to them to figure out how they're going to make that happen. I think more fascinating than anything else about SRE is that SREs are tasked with about 50% of their time being proactive. So 50% is reactive, incident management, change management, service level management, but they are required to make tomorrow better than today. So they are required to automate their way out of manual work, otherwise known as toil. And so part of the SRE's job is to refuse to do manual work over and over and over, and to have the technical capabilities to automate when possible, right? So all of those low-end tasks. And then like ITIL, like DevOps, like Agile, like SRE looks at failure as an opportunity to improve. So if you kind of look at the 3 ways and SRE, well, we want to be able to increase flow. And the best way to do that is to look at your service level objectives, right? Service level objectives are the difference between 100% reliability and what's been considered or what's been agreed to, not as SLA, no contracts, right? But what's been agreed to as an objective for that service, right? The ability to regulate their own workload means that they can have shortened feedback loops, because the interaction of the SRE with the development teams, the continuous delivery teams, it happens very naturally, right? They become a strong part of systems thinking. And then, of course, continuous learning means that you have to be able to learn from failure. And so looking at incidents, looking at changes, really understanding that culture of continuous learning, experimentation, so that you can become a master by practice, is embedded into this as well. And I said, I really am very fascinated by SRE for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is they are tasked with not accepting the fact that a lot of the work is very redundant, very manual, and they really are charged with making tomorrow better than today. And I said, we're seeing that in a lot of case studies right now. You know, as I said, it's really interesting. So SRE adoption's risen from 10% to 15%, actually almost 16% in the upcoming DevOps Institute upskilling report. So we're definitely seeing a rise in interest, and I'll show you why in just a minute. It is the fifth fastest growing IT role for 2020. Frankly, it's one of the reasons that DevOps Institute has introduced an SRE Foundation course and certification through our partners, because we think that a lot of what's happening here is something that's very modern and is rising very, very quickly. Here's the interesting thing, and again, no disrespect to ITIL, but it is really kind of fascinating watching this growth. Site reliability engineering did not grow up as part of DevOps, so it isn't kind of a part of what we'll call the DevOps system. It grew up on its own, partially launched because of the Google bug. But if you look at kind of the evolution of small and fast and self-regulating systems, it started in 2001 with the Agile Manifesto for Agile software development, right? Which is go small, go incremental, right? So create this kind of constant cycle of development, but also allow the Scrum teams or allow the Agile teams to be self-organizing, which means they agree on the work that they're going to do. There's a Scrum Master that protects them, and they self-regulate in terms of how they're going to get it done with help, right? With help. Then you move into continuous integration, continuous delivery, and again, the emphasis on removing some of the manual work, shifting a lot of those tasks left, creating hybrid people that have multiple skills. But it is also a self-regulating system, right? Nobody's telling them what automation to put into place or what open source software to use. It is a self-regulating system that, by the way, is now interoperable with the Agile software team. Well, the frustration about DevOps for me, all these years that I've been involved in it, is that DevOps always seemed to end at deployment, right? It's like, okay, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, stop, start again. And as somebody who comes from operations, I've always wanted to kind of yell out, well, now what, right? Once it's in production, do we not have a series of practices that align with Agile and DevOps, because it is only then that the service is actually being delivered. And I think SRE is the third part of that feedback loop, right? When we look at SRE as being a little bit more technical, looking at practices like service level objectives. There's a practice for change management I'll tell you about in a minute called error budgets. So it is the same processes in many ways as ITIL, but in a different perspective, right? It is Google says it's their approach to managing services. So if you're at all involved in service management, or you're a software engineer, or you're an infrastructure engineer, I really would encourage you to learn about both ITIL4, but in particular, site reliability engineering, because again, kind of same practices, a little bit more of an organic approach to it, and interoperable. SREs, again, reach way back into development. Sorry, you can probably tell I'm a little fascinated by SRE, but I've been watching it from the beginning. I went to some early SRE cons, and it is pretty interesting stuff. So again, just to wrap up and give you a little bit of time for some questions, really the difference between the two, or if you look at the crossroads between DevOps and IT service management, it's really a change management, right? There are papers that are written about change management in a modern environment, a lot of frustration with organizations that still have a change advisory board. Some moved it to a change approval board. The inherent delays sometimes with change management is very frustrating. There was a paper written by Gene Kim. I was one of the authors of it, on breaking down the change management barrier from IT revolution and looking at how do you migrate to a more modern approach. But if you really compare ITIL4 and site reliability engineering, it depends on the organization, right? It really does depend on the organization. ITIL4, as I said before, is a governance model. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're, a non-regulated environment, you shouldn't consider it. But ITIL4 looks at change control. Right now, they changed it to change enablement in the second edition of some of the books, but the purpose directly from ITIL4 is to maximize the number of successful IT changes by ensuring that risks have been assessed, changes have been authorized, and a change schedule is being managed. So it is still a linear approach, and there still are several gates to go through to get into production. The problem with and it isn't a problem with ITIL4, it's the problem with the application of change management, is that in some cases it became a one-size-fits-all, right? So every change has to go through all those gates. Every change needs 2 weeks in advance to be approved, and that's not very DevOpsy. So that's not what ITIL4 is saying. ITIL4 does have peer-to-peer review. It does authorize local decision authorities, but recognize that ITIL4 is a governance model, right? And truthfully, that has always been the foundation of ITIL, is a command and control approach. Site reliability engineering, as I said, is more about self-organization. And so there's an established set of service level objectives against which the team has to manage, right? So their first and primary goal is to ensure that the SLO is met, right? But the team is given an error budget. It's agreed to, right? The error budget says, as long as you maintain this level of reliability, then you can change at will. And if the SLO is breached, there are policies and consequences that are associated with it, some of which include no more changes until the underlying problem is met. So from the SRE book, an error budget, you might be hearing that term a lot more coming up, is a very clear objective metric that determines how unreliable the service is allowed to be within a single quarter. Right, so as long as they're meeting the SLO, and that requires the alignment of the development teams, of the continuous delivery teams, the operations teams. They can't, you can't do this only in operation, so they have to work very, very closely to meet that SLO. A lot of testing, right? A lot of security. As long as it's being met, new releases can be pushed. So there's no approval process, there's no change advisory board, but it does need policies and consequences. So again, same spirit, a little bit different. One's more of a governance model, one is more of a trust but verify type of model. So regardless of the framework, the truth is ITSM has to become more agile. In my introduction, I am the author of the Agile Service Management Guide, which kind of takes a page from Scrum and looks at process and says, first of all, if we're going to have microservices, let's have microprocesses. And the question is, how much is just enough process, right? Just enough process to allow that faster, more frequent flow. So you're welcome to go up to the DevOps Institute website. You can download the Agile Service Management Guide for free and look at some of the practices that make creating process, particularly service management process, a little bit more agile. So I want to give everybody a little time for questions. So let me just sum it up. If you take all of the principles from ITIL4 and site reliability engineering, and then you look at DevOps as 3 ways, the message here is you got to put it all together. Right, really, one is not meant to replace the other. One is not necessarily going to be the magic solution. DevOps is not your magic solution. ITIL4 is not your magic solution. SRE is not your magic solution to solve all of IT's world problems, right? But the principles are good. So start where you are, right? What is the area that you need the most focus, that you need the most improvement on? But make sure you're focusing on value. And in order for you to focus on value, you have to first understand what value is to your customers. So maybe a value stream mapping exercise. Look to increase your flow from left to right, right? That's the only way that water flows, right? It doesn't go backwards. So you have to look at where your constraints are and how you can overcome that. Make sure you self-regulate with consequences, right? Treat people like adults. give them objectives to meet, but give them an opportunity to self-regulate as well. But make tomorrow better than today, right? You know, it's a lead, follow, or get out of the way type of model. Optimize and automate when possible. Right, so reduce your toil by letting the systems, letting the automation do some of that manual labor. Failure is always an opportunity to improve, and there's a lot of initiatives out there about learning from failure. Be comfortable experimenting, safe experimentation, mindful experimentation. But, you know, as I've said several times, you can't become a master if you don't practice. So hackathons, small incremental changes that can be remediated if need be. And then finally, look for minimum viable process. Thick, heavy process is bureaucratic. It stops flow. So really have that discussion of what minimum viable process actually is. And then challenge yourself to be what we call T-shaped, right? I keep saying, using the term hybrid human, right? Have your depth of competency, but also don't ignore the fact of broad competency. So if you're a developer, maybe you need to understand DevOps testing. If you're a security person, maybe you need to understand infrastructure. And certainly for site reliability engineering, they are the kind of the epitome, the role is the epitome of a hybrid human, because they could do some coding, they could do some automating, they can manage service level objectives, right? They can handle incidents. They're the ones that get awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning. It is the dawn of the T-shaped hybrid human. And next week, we're even going to take that a little further and talk to you about E-shaped humans, which is kind of an extension of this. So if you want to learn more, DevOps Institute through partners like NovelVista have 8 certifications around DevOps that are very, very specific to different competencies. They don't necessarily certify you as a site reliability engineer, but you'll have enough knowledge to be able to take it to the next level. Each of these competencies are very, very aligned with the practices of DevOps. And as I said before, please join our free community. So with that, I'm hoping I have maybe a few questions.
Yes, Jane, and thanks for such a beautiful session. It was quite informative. So now we'll open it for everyone to raise the questions. So team, you can put your questions in the question section so that we can read it out to Jane.
Well, while we're thinking of our questions, why don't I run one last poll?
Yeah.
So which of the following is being used in your organization? And I'm hoping while you're doing that, you're thinking of some solid questions for me.
So Jane, while we are running this poll, there is a question from Rajendra. He's asking, what is budget errors?
Sorry, what is what?
Budget errors.
Oh, error budgets. Okay, yeah. Let me close the poll and I'll answer that question because I think it's a great question. So let me share those results. So about 59% of you are starting to use DevOps, 49% Agile software development. That's interesting. CI/CD, 46%, ITIL, 84%, and 14% are SRE. I would bet you next year we're going to see that that number go high. So let me tell you a little bit about error budgets. So in an organization that needs to go faster, the teams, right, the agile teams, the continuous integration delivery teams, the site reliability teams need to know what the definition of success is, right? So a service level objective is really the definition of success. It's the agreed reliability of a service. Right, you call it a service level in ITIL, service level management. The difference here is that the SLA, the service level agreement in ITIL, was kind of the thing, right? You needed your customer to sign this SLA, and most of the time the SLA really didn't address the service level. So if we're going to give the teams an objective, a service level objective, then they also need to understand what kind of budget do they have in order to make changes, which means what sort of failure, if you want to use that word, right? So as long as they meet the SLO, and remember the SLO is the difference between 100% and whatever the objective is. So as long as they maintain that, let's say it's 99.999%, right? As long as they maintain that, they're given the autonomy, right? They're approved to push changes into production without any other authority. So they're allowed to have a budget that says you could spend this at will, right? So Google will be the first to tell you the error budget is meant to be spent. And as long as they keep meeting the objectives, the service level objectives, they can keep pushing changes. Now, if they breach the service level objective, right, which means there's an outage or a failure that reduces the service level, then there are consequences, right? And there are policies that are associated with the error budget. But basically that product or that team or that service is given a budget, like you're given a budget for, you know, your weekly expenses, right? As long as you stay within your budget, you're good. If you breach a budget, you know, there's likely going to be someone to answer to, if not yourself. It's really the same concept, but it opens the door so that changes can happen very, very organically, and it doesn't require approvals for those changes. The only thing that matters is the quality of the service. And the quality of the service is reflected in being able to meet that service level objective. Nothing else counts, right? Nothing else counts. Who cares if we're making a lot of changes as long as the quality of the service is what's expected, right? Who needs to approve it? The problem with change management and its approvals is that often those that are making the approval are the ones that are not really intimately familiar with the change. Right? So they're not the developer, they're not the operations people, they're not the continuous delivery people. So there's an inherent delay there. So with an error budget, it's letting people that are closest to the change decide that the change is ready for production because they know that they're going to be held accountable for that service level objective or that service level quality. Does that make sense?
Yep. So, Jane, there is a related question from Omkar. He's saying how to manage the change records or how to maintain the change records in case of error budgets for any audits in the future. Yeah.
Good, very, very good question. So remember, there's a difference between a request for change and a change record. Right? A request for change is you're asking if you can make the change. A change record is you're recording the fact that the change has been made. And that still is a requirement. You still have to record the change, right? Because somewhere along the way, if there's an incident, you have to be able to answer the question, what changed? So there is still a requirement to record changes. Now, how the change is recorded it may be different from organization to organization, right? What data is collected may be different from organization to organization. But the difference between a record and a request, so RFC is a request, right? A change record is a historical record. It says that here's what we've done in case anybody needs to know that. So make no mistake about it, even with an error budget, you still need to record the change. And again, how you do that may be different than maybe how you're doing it today, or it may be the same, right? Generally, it's not as complex, but it's using systems that the developers can see, the continuous delivery people can see, and the SRE people can see. In many ITSM environments, the RFC or the change record can't be seen by, say, the service desk. So again, remember, you still have to record it. You might not need to request it.
Yeah. So Jane, Onkar is further saying that in case if you are recording it, that will still add up to some cycle time. So how to manage that?
Well, again, remember, how you record it is not necessarily the same. So let me give you an example. The automation could record it for you, right? Whatever automated release orchestration you're using may actually be able to create the record for you. Remember, the goal here is to reduce toil, right? So you don't want cycle time. You don't want to spend 30, 40 minutes, filling out a record, most of which information is not even relevant, right? So there is a possibility that logs, that other automation can be used as a record of the change. And that can also be automated into, some of the service management products. A lot of the service management products are really now starting to adapt to the changing way that we operate. So, come on, how boring is it to have to sit down for 30 minutes and fill out a change record or a change request? So that's toil, right? That's toil. And SRE defines what toil is and how to reduce it. We could do a whole separate webinar on this, right? Change management in the modern world.
Yeah, Jane. So Jane, there is another question, or I would say a request from Manoj. He says, can you talk a little bit on toil, as we were just touching the toil?
So toil, think about the word toil. So SRE defines toil as any manual and repetitive work. So for a site reliability engineering, the job, if that role has to do the same task multiple times, the same manual task multiple times, then they are not only even encouraged, they're almost required to look at ways of automating that task, right? What's available, talk to the developers, talk to the continuous delivery people. They have skill on their own. Most site reliability engineers have Python skills. Most have some type of software engineering capabilities. By the way, everybody today has to at least learn Python, right? Everybody's a developer in some way or another, but they're required to identify ways to automate that manual task, because doing the same manual task day in, day out is not a good spend of time, right? A site reliability engineer is encouraged to be able to use what only humans can do, which is critical thinking skills, at least today. And spending time doing manual tasks is not a good investment in time. Google advocates that it is better to invest that time in identifying ways to reduce the toil, right? Reduce the manual repetitive tasks so that the human can do more higher level thinking or more higher level development or more higher level work. So toil is any type of manual repetitive work that could be automated. The question is, of course, identifying how. And with open source software, there are obviously opportunities to automate with skills that are associated with SRE. They have the ability to be able to do that. And remember, when people say SRE is so technical, we're IT people. We're supposed to be technical.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so Jane, there are a couple of questions, so I'll quickly put them across and then we can call it a day. And Jane, so first question is from Omkar, and he's asking that if there are so many changes related to applications day in and day out, and let's say we are working in Agile, we are working in the ITIL4 environment where we are managing the services. So how do we relate those application changes which are handled via agile approach and relate them to ITIL4? How do we do it? So
that's a huge challenge. And I think, again, we could probably do a whole separate webinar on change management, but it is one of the reasons I think that practices like SRE have grown up. And even looking at ITIL4, I said the challenge with ITIL4 is we don't know enough yet. Right. So again, confidence is that maybe in future publications it'll address this. But under ITIL4, many organizations stood up a change advisory board and made it a change approval board, and every change had to go to the CAB, and there were delays. Right. And more importantly, I think those that are on the CAB may not be closest to the change. So in an ITIL4 v3 environment, the first thing I would suggest is to identify which of those changes could you declare as standard, right? So a standard change is pre-approved, we understand the risk. It doesn't even mean that it's a change that happens frequently. It's just that the team understands what the risk is and they have done appropriate testing, they've done appropriate security. And so the first thing you do is you try to declare more changes as standard, which means they don't have to go to the cab, right? And then the cab really only has to assess those that have a much, much higher risk to a larger population. So that's kind of step one. And that may be, you know, kind of the first step to creating your first error budget, right? Is that you declare a larger number of, you know, some people think a standard change is break fix, right? No, it isn't. If it's a change that you understand the risk and you have good steps in place to mitigate that risk, then it could be a standard change.
Yes, absolutely. So in fact, when we are talking about agile service management or agile change management, the approving authority can be defined based on minimum requirement, which are the least number of people required to approve that set of change, or we can treat them as a type of standard change. So in one of the organizations, we had implemented that, and which actually helped us in increasing the speed rather than waiting for the entire cab approval, which we used to do only once a week. So absolutely right.
Yeah.
So thanks, Jane, on that. And one last question. That question is from Santosh. He says, being a system engineer and without much knowledge of software development engineering, how does SRE help if he's choosing this as a career path?
So excuse me, I think SRE breathes new life into systems engineers and particularly into anyone that's in an operational role. So the first thing I would think is, first of all, understand the practices of SRE, which, you know, one of the reasons DevOps Institute created SRE Foundation, which is you know, doesn't really dive deep into technology, but really looks at the practices, the same as ITIL Foundation or DevOps Foundation, is to develop that kind of understanding of what's associated with it. And then, you know, the next step is everybody has to learn to test. So DevOps test engineering, whether you're QA or not, everybody has to understand the basics of testing because we're testing everything right now. Developers have to test, build engineers have to test, operations people have to test as well. Everyone at some point or another is going to need to learn the basics of code, right? So whether it's Python, which is, from what I mean, little kids learn Python. I figured I could learn Python, and I'm not a developer either. But really developing kind of a mentality that looks at, if you're a systems engineer, you're technical, right? So understanding the basics of SRE, understanding the basics of code, looking at some of the open source applications that are out there. And again, you know, become a member of DevOps Institute. We have a lot of assets out there for people to read and understand about this, but go through training, right? Go through training and develop some of those skills. That's part of being a hybrid human, right? Is that if you're a systems engineer or you're a developer, you know, any of those deep competencies, you now need to fill the top of your T with other experiences and other competencies, other skills.
Absolutely. Adding that horizontal part of the T. That's absolutely right. And yeah, thank you so much, Jane, for such an informative session. And it was really a good insight on SRE. I hope people had a lot of doubts and now they're clear about what SRE is all about and how it plays a role in being a bridge between DevOps and ITIL4. And if they have any further questions, so guys, I would request you to send your questions to us, and we can always get them answered with the help of Jane. And thank you, Jane. Thanks for such a wonderful session. Thank you.
Oh, and thank you for inviting me to today's session. And thank you for those that spent some time. And you know, I always say it, we're really, really proud to have NovelVista as one of our partners. Appreciate everything you do for the community and for the humans of DevOps.
Thank you, Jane. And
All right.
have a yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And we will close this session.